For more, let's cross to London. Javier Sajuria is Professor of Comparative Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thanks for having me.
What's the mood? This is the day after an election. We knew this was coming after the first round because it was a lopsided result. Nonetheless, you saw in that report one of those supporters of Jose Antonio Kast brandishing a photo of former dictator Augusto Pinochet.
You have to remember that the country, back in 1988, over 40% of the people voted for Pinochet to remain in power. So the fact that you have people who are reminiscent of the dictatorship is not particularly surprising. Also, Chile never did a clean cut with the policies of the dictatorship. Many of the members of the regime became politicians from the right-wing parties and stayed in power, or at least in office as in the Congress for many years. And if you have to stretch this argument further, you will see that Pinochet himself remained as the chair of the army, the commander-in-chief of the army for a long time, for a long period after finishing his term as a dictator, as a president. So in a way, Chile never did a clean cut between the policy of the dictatorship and the actual government. And the right wing struggled a lot with that. And I think it wasn't until Sebastián Piñera became president back in 2009 that he managed to somehow show a different side of the right, which was more democratic, being Piñera one of the early detractors of Pinochet.
So how will history then remember the failed attempt by the outgoing president to reform the Constitution, the left's Gabriel Boric, whose term limited? That did not pass. Could there have been that clean break, or is this just the way Chile is?
Well, there's a number of things. There's clearly a correlation between the vote in that 2022 referendum and the vote that Kast got. And you see that across different regions, but also you see that in the case of the actual size of the landslide, or the size of the victory he got. However, we also have to remember that right after the 22 referendum, where the position of the government of a new constitutional project was rejected, there was another constitutional process, and this time the Republican Party, led by Kast, won the majority of the seats in this new convention, and their project, which was an ultra-conservative project, also was rejected by a referendum. So Chile has gone through two different processes. However, that doesn't mean that the election right now is a confirmation of this right wing of ultra-conservative positions. I think there's a combination of a country that hasn't seen any incumbents retaining office since 2005, with some sort of a zeitgeist of right wing and particularly far right positions and far right leaders across the world, and Latin America as well. You mentioned Milei, Bolsonaro. You can add to that Bukele and even Trump if you add the Americas.
And of course, they're still counting ballots over in Honduras, where there could be another pro-Trump candidate who could win. Yeah, so like you say, Chile's used to, it's kind of become a tradition. First, a left-wing president succeeded by a right-wing president, and the pendulum swings. But this isn't a right-wing president, is it? It's a far-right president.
Yes, that is correct. And that particular label has been challenged by many within his camp, because they see the far-right label as being some sort of a pejorative terms, but they don't realize that Chile has traditionally had a center-right, or a mainstream right, which was defeated in the first round. That was Evelyn Matei's candidacy. And she was part of this traditional right-wing parties that were in government with Piñera twice, actually. This is a far-right candidate and a far-right president, and it's very clear not only by his policies. I mean, we talk about the iron fist policies in terms of crime and immigration, but also you have to remember that Kast is a person who has been leading the fight against what he calls cultural war and progressive values around the world. Up until 2024, he was a leader of the Political Network for Values, which is an organization that goes around the world trying to ban homosexuality, ban abortion rights, and limit reproductive rights in general. And he was leading this organization for 2 years, between 2022 and 24. And he's also very close to leaders of the far right across the world. He is a regular speaker at CPAC, which takes place both in Hungary and the US, where he hangs around with the likes of Giorgia Meloni, Viktor Orban, the Vox leaders in Spain, Nigel Farage and others, and also, of course, Trump, Bolsonaro and Milei. So he belongs to that family, both culturally, ideologically, and also kind of in terms of personal relations. And that is very important to remember. Now, the difference is that he looks much more like, I would say, the European version of the far right, one that aims to build political parties and aims to build grassroots, whereas the more kind of American style of the far right, and I'm claiming Trump, Bukele, and Milei amongst them, is more strident and is more from outsiders that don't necessarily want to build a party that can either take over, which is the case of Trump, or they can build very loose coalitions, like in the case of Milei. Kast is more reminiscent to what we see in France or what we see in Italy or Spain in that matter,
Okay,
but not in terms of ideas.
All right, and he doesn't wield a chainsaw, but we saw recently with those midterm elections in Argentina that Javier Milei gained ground. So bearing down on immigration and violent crime and, like you say, liberal social values, is that just now a winning formula when you're in Chile?
Well, the case of Chile is also interesting because when you look at the different far-right leaders and far-right movements across the region, unlike European ones, immigration is never an issue, right? So when you look at the case of, again, El Salvador, Honduras, or Argentina, and so on, the immigration issue is not there. Chile is unique in that particular aspect, right? So it's way more like the European cases, and unlike the European cases where immigration is usually attached to ideas of anti-Muslim or Islamophobic views, here we're talking about immigration from Venezuela. So it's a very interesting case. Now, the truth is that the levels of immigration in Chile have increased dramatically in the past 12 years or even so. And the country hasn't done enough to integrate or to simulate or somehow manage the levels of immigration. And that is truth. Now, has that led to a number of bad outcomes as Kast tried to portray during the campaign? Probably not. That was an exaggeration. The other thing about crime, Chile is one of the safest countries in the region, has been one of the safest countries in the region for many years. However, it's a country where the people are scared the most about crime. So there's a responsibility there by political leaders on the far right and the media in some sort of building that gap between the reality of the crime situation in the country and the expectations and the perceptions of people. And Kast has fed from that particular gap and has also increased that gap in his discourse and the way he presented the results. The question we would like to see now is, now that he will be in power in March, will he be able to close that gap, to make people feel safer without much room to actually change things in terms of numbers and figures?
All right,